Welcome to the teaching ministry of Lakeside Alliance Church. We are a movement of people who are passionate about pursuing Jesus Christ. If you're in Southeast Wisconsin, join us on a Sunday morning and consider partnering in a mission that matters. For now, sit back and open your heart as we hear from Pastor John.
There are moments when the fog of life lifts, when things get crystal clear for us to look out from the summit of God's gracious, sovereign plan, where we look at life's problems and pains and paradoxes and promises and particulars, and we can see all of them in their rightful place. And what's revealed about the plan in the midst of all of that is that it's for our good. It's for our good. Which oftentimes sounds almost too good to be true, doesn't it? The idea that God had something good in mind with some horrific situation that you went through seems pretty hard to swallow. Personally, there have been times I've heard those kinds of statements and I just felt or thought or even said out loud, prove it. Prove it, because I don't know how that could possibly be true with this. How could God ever put that person into my life? How could God ever allow that death, that failure to be part of his plan for my life or for their life or for our lives? And I have little doubt, that if you've lived for very long, that you can sympathize with that questioning of God's wisdom. It's just the idea that God is somehow working out one giant plan in your life and my life and the whole world that is intended for good. Which is a good issue to raise, given the idea behind this sermon series. The guy's been telling one big story throughout all of Scripture, and it's a story that's marching right on through our lives today. And so to be getting, I think, then a better grasp on this kind of claim about God's wisdom and his goodness and what it means for a Christian, I think it's really important. And with these kinds of questions and claims top of mind today, then we want to turn and we want to consider this morning the last patriarch that we're going to look at in this series, which is Joseph, which is the life of Joseph. I've labeled Joseph, though, a patriarch, and I think that that's a very fitting title for him, even though it would be through his brother Judah that God would actually bring about the redemption of humanity through his family and his line there. And his life of Judah and Joseph, these are lives that are oftentimes set in contrast to each other. But I think that a patriarch is an appropriate title for Joseph because the book of Genesis clearly pivots to place the spotlight now on Joseph's life as one of Jacob's 12 sons, and it would be Joseph who would be the man who God would use to preserve his family. And so I think it's an appropriate title. And Joseph then offers us a very fitting punctuation mark for all of the patriarchs as we conclude this foundational portion of the One Big Story series as we consider his life. And Joseph's life is one full of twists and turns that are recorded in Genesis chapters 37 to chapter 50. Chapter 50 is where we'll be at this morning, so you can turn your Bibles there. But the background of this last chapter of Genesis, it's crucial for us to understand. Here we find Jacob, after he has moved back to the land of Canaan, which is what we looked at last week, if you're here for that. Otherwise, you can find it online. But Jacob there, he settles down and he's developing his family. He's building a life for himself there. And as he does so with his family, he begins to give special favoritism to his son Joseph. He gives special favoritism to his son Joseph. That seems to be maybe a thing in Jacob's life with his mother and now with his own son. But most notably with this favoritism, it's seen in how he gives him a very special coat of many colors. Now, some of you right now, you're thinking to yourself back to high school, and you're thinking about Joseph and the amazing technicolored dream coat, and you're remembering all those times and good times with the stage crew or something. But I just want to go on record and let you know, I'm pretty sure there were no big musical numbers in Joseph's life, okay? So, I don't know where they got those from, but they weren't from the Bible. However, as the story goes on, Joseph begins to have multiple dreams that God gives him about his family coming and bowing down before him. And as he shares with those dreams with his family, you can probably guess about how well those go over. Very badly. And his brothers, they actually move from not liking him over this favoritism issue to hating him. And eventually, they kidnap Joseph. They throw him into a pit to die, but then they decide instead to sell him to slave traders for 20 shekels of silver. Because after all, he is their brother, and they've got to, show some mercy here, right? So instead, he's set to die in Egypt. But God didn't abandon Joseph in the midst of that betrayal. Instead, he caused Joseph to actually thrive in Egypt as he becomes a manager of a man named Potiphar's house. There again, though, there would be another twist in Joseph's life as he is falsely accused of rape and wrongfully imprisoned. But there again, even in the midst of his life in prison, God allows him to prosper and he becomes in charge of the prison. And with all these ups and downs, God is actually testing Joseph. We're told that in Psalm 98. God is testing Joseph, and he remained faithful. And God brought about then a miraculous turn of events where he became, of all things, the prime minister of Egypt, under the Pharaoh there. God placed him in that position 7 years before a great worldwide, for that regional worldwide in that sense, famine would take place. That would save then that region of the world from starvation as Joseph would use those years for preparation. At the same time, God would then use that famine to bring his brothers all the way over to the doorstep of his house in Egypt. God would draw his brothers to him. And through an intriguing set of events, rather than killing them, Joseph is actually kind to them. And eventually resettles his entire family, including his father Jacob, in the land of Goshen in Egypt, which is how the Israelites came to be in the nation of Egypt. It was through God's sovereign choice to preserve them from this massive famine, to spare their lives. So then we find after this very touching reunion of father and son and some other key moments in there, Jacob finally then in his old age passes away, which sends the entire family on a very long trek with a great big caravan all the way back to the land of Canaan to bury Jacob in his own tomb there in the land. And that's a journey I'm sure was stirred up all kinds of emotions. All kinds of memories for the whole family, especially Joseph. And it's at this juncture, though, that this key moment in Joseph's life, and this capstone moment for the book of Genesis occurs. Where after all of this, we read then in Genesis 50 these words. It says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for the evil that we did to him. So he sent a message to Joseph saying, your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. In this first portion of the scene, Joseph's brothers, perhaps 10 of them, as Benjamin has shown tremendous favor by Joseph, that these brothers, they are in tremendous fear of Joseph's revenge. This is a vengeance that would have been considered just and very well within Joseph's power to be able to achieve as the prime minister. Certainly, the brothers have, and they're in fact fully confessing to the evil that they have perpetrated. There's no escaping that truth, nor should there be. What they've done to Joseph was horrible. It was inexcusable. So in their message here, they don't even try to lean on their own goodness. Instead, what do? They lean on the words of their father. They lean on the corporate relationship that they have with one another to God. Based on that, they plead for Joseph's forgiveness. It's a forgiveness that Joseph, by the way, granted to them back in chapter 47, but it's one that they now fear that he's going to reverse since Jacob has passed away. And so Joseph, he hears these words and he weeps. We're not actually told exactly why Joseph weeps in the text. But what I would point out is that in Genesis, Joseph weeps 9 times. 9 times. That's a lot for a few chapters. But it seems to me that probably Joseph is mourning the price of evil. He's mourning what it has cost him personally, again and again and again. But that's what his weeping shows us. There's probably a lesson on grief in there for us as well, but the scene keeps moving forward. And for whatever reason, grief is Joseph's only recorded response to his brother's message, which prompts his brothers then to come in person. Verse 18, his brothers also came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." Which, by the way, this is another direct fulfillment of the dream that God gave Joseph, the dreams that actually launched this whole thing into this other direction with his life. And yet seeing God's ongoing fulfillment of his word, this seems to be what is prompting, what is giving the gravitas to Joseph's response. Where next it says, "But Joseph said to them, 'Do not fear. For am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive, as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones.'" And then the passage ends with this very beautiful little statement. It says, "Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them." So right here, I want us to pause now. Having thus far in this series consumed then the lives of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and especially Joseph. And I want us to imagine what the original audience to this book must have felt in hearing it. I mean, if you're reading along with this story that even forecasts all the way back in the life of Abraham, what's going to happen, that these people are going to be brought into a time of bondage in Egypt, then how would you feel reading this? Would you read about Jacob's lives, Joseph's lives, then with a sense of dread? Where you're desperately not wanting them to go to Egypt while simultaneously knowing that that is exactly where they're going to end up? I think so. I think up to this point, you'd feel like you were watching a movie, a documentary on the making of the French Revolution, or the Battle of Bull Run, or Dunkirk, or the Titanic, or even the first fight in Rocky III. You'd be feeling like you are watching and willing against the downward trajectory that you know will happen. The Israelite reader, you know that hundreds of years of enslavement in Egypt is coming. That horrific heartache, you know that there's evil, that there's pain that is coming to your people with each and every step that these men make towards Egypt. But at the same time, you know that the story that you're told right here in Genesis 50, that this is one where evil is not the end of the story. You're told all the way back here in Genesis that evil is not the end of the story. Instead, it tells you how evil only serves to play a role in a much larger story that God is ultimately telling for your good. That's the story. It's for your good. And this story, it's one that then walks right through evil for our good. That's the big claim of this text. It is a passage that stands at the end of Genesis, standing on the summit of God's gracious sovereign plan, looking out from Genesis to Egypt, to each and every one of our lives, and it can look backwards and forwards, and it can announce that God's plan is for good. It's a plan that moves right through evil for our good, giving us every reason to place our faith in Him. It's a plan that gives us every reason to place our faith in God. That's how great His plan really is. That's how great it is. That was true for the Israelites in the Exodus. That is true for you and me in the church today. God will keep His promise, and He will bring about a plan that glorifies Him and redeems us. It's a plan that walks then right through the worst that our world has to offer. Appreciate how Dr. John Sailhammer put it. He said, behind the events and human plans recounted in the story of Joseph lies the unchanging plan of God. It is the same plan introduced from the beginning of the book, where God looked out at what He had created and saw that it was good. Through His dealings with the patriarchs and Joseph, God continued to bring about His good plan. He remained faithful to the promises, and His narrative shows that God's people can continue to trust and believe that in all things, God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. So while I know full well the wrestling that this claim stirs up in our hearts, I cannot imagine a more reassuring truth to offer our hearts in dealing with the worst that this world has to offer. That from war in the Middle East to war in our hearts, we can know that things are not out of control. Nothing is out of control. God is here. He is at work. His purposes will stand. And you can know that. You can know that in whatever it is that you have been going through in your life, whatever addiction, whatever accident, whatever tragedy, whatever disease, whatever loss that you have experienced, you can know God's here. He's in control. And He has a plan. And He's going to walk right through that evil to bring about something good. Not around it. He walks through it. So while I don't know what God's plan is for my life or for yours, I don't know how it will turn out tomorrow, I do know that it is meant for good. Even when other people make plans that are meant for evil. As Dr. J.I. Packer framed it, Joseph's theology was as sound as his charity was deep. Once again, we are confronted with the wisdom of God ordering the events of a human life for a double purpose. The individual's own personal sanctification and the fulfilling of his appointed ministry and service in the life of the people of God. I want to further emphasize that point about this claim when it comes to the goodness of God's plan. Because as a follower of His, I need to trust that God's plan, it doesn't just offer some kind of general good out there. It's not just some kind of general good, but God takes it further. He takes it further, which means that when we look at this, we can see it personally. It means that, church, while we may weep like Joseph over the tragic evils of our lives, we can also have faith that through those moments knowing how they exist for our good, that we can then, as a child of God, look at these things and join with Joseph in saying what was intended for evil, God has intended for my good, for the good of others, for the good of future generations, even for the glory of his name. We can have that kind of faith in that truth day by day. And living out a living faith like that, in this truth, it lets me love my enemies. It lets me love my enemies. It empowers me with a faith-filled way of looking at things where I can forgive them, where I can choose to not return evil for evil. I can choose to bless those who curse me, to do good to those who persecute me. That we can act like Joseph, or even more so, we can act like Jesus Christ towards them. This truth empowers a faith-filled way of approaching life that is transformational as we see God's plan moving through the evil in our lives for our good, giving us every reason to place our faith in him. However, as I mentioned at the beginning, our hearts oftentimes struggle with this truth. And that is particularly the case when we are either exiting a season of pain, we are in the midst of suffering wrongs from others, or we are dealing with resentment from things that they didn't work out the way we wanted them to. We have undealt with bitterness and resentment in our hearts. Then we can really struggle to believe this truth. Then we have to repent so we can move forward. So I want to poke around this further with this passage so that we can see, though, some of the kinds of goodness that God brings out of evil that should spark a growing faith in him. And there's 4 really challenging examples of good that we can see right here in the text. And I think it just really drives this claim home. I want you to see the first. Here it is. Number 1, he positions us to do good to others. This is the first thing he's up to. He's positioning us to do good to others. This is one of those points that can get really obscured when we are being pressed and not responding in faith. But as we see in this text, especially verse 21, that was Joseph's assumed position in offering forgiveness and compassion by providing for his brothers, their families, comforting them in their fear in a strange and foreign land, speaking kindly to them. Joseph recognized all of this, and he gave credit to God that despite the horrendous things that had happened, that God had used it to position him to do good to them. This is jaw-dropping as it gets. As we think that God has positioned us to do good, even towards those who hate us, who have hurt us. It begs the question, just in general then, of how has God positioned you through your pain to do good to others? How has he done that? Can you be a comforting presence for someone else because of what you've been through? Can you be? Or are you still stuck with it? You're still hanging on to the bitterness and the resentment, and you're unable to be of good to anybody else going through the same kind of pain. We need to come to that point, friend, where we recognize God has a plan, even for our pain. Maybe you could speak kindly to someone going through a painful experience by sharing what you've learned through yours. Maybe you can be tangibly providing for someone in a family experiencing a setback, experiencing a loss, doing so with a deeper knowledge of what they need because of the hurt that you've experienced too. Perhaps God has placed you there for such a time as this. I bet he has. And this should be our stance towards others as Christians, even in our pain. One such example I saw years ago with a family that tragically lost their son. He was in his 20s, and it happened very unexpectedly one autumn Wednesday evening. They called the church and got a hold of me and was able to drop everything and head on over to them. There was another elder at the church that had heard about it as well, though, and he did the same. So we were sitting there with this family in their living room and in the midst of just what was overwhelming pain. As I watched this elder with me, I watched him operating with what I can only describe as a deeper level of understanding with this family. Watching him that evening left me with this deep impression and a very serious sense of gratitude for the way that he was able to help. He was able to care for these folks in the midst of their shock and their loss at a deep level. And it was only later that then I learned that this saint had also lost his son in his 20s. He understood what they were going through. But of course, that's how God works. That's how he works. He never wastes a Christian's pain. And he won't start with yours. But as a Christian, through the hardships of your life, God will bring good. In part by positioning us to do good through the worst events of our lives. So let's trust him enough so that we obediently show compassion to others out of the places that he has brought us through. That's one example. Here's the second way God does this. He blesses us to bless future generations. Future generations. We see this in verse 20 and in chapter 47 when Joseph's talking about the same topic. They show us how he understood God to be bringing about a redemptive plan for the whole people of Israel through the evil choices that his brothers made. And so he says, as he says, many people should be kept alive. So as one set of scholars expressed it, this does not exonerate the wicked actions that carry out such evil. But it does give us the broadest vision for what is happening at any given point of history. When evil seems to triumph most horrifically, God is there. He's with his people. He's working out his redemptive purposes. And this is the big picture view that we need to adapt with our problems. The blessings of God's plan operating in your life and mine, it allows us to bless future generations in a myriad of ways as we continue to faithfully follow him despite our tragic losses. In my life, I can't believe all of the ways that God has used my family. Going through hardships as a kid, financial hardships, the loss of loved ones in the flower of life, grandparents persevering in ministry through really tough circumstances, and so many more examples to shape an attitude in my family today with a desire to honor the Lord. If you're a second generation Christian, you've likely seen firsthand the blessings that God has given you through the hardships of your parents. The lessons that you've learned. And when we are faithful to the Lord, he faithfully uses our hardships to bless the next generation. Just think of your children if you have them, right? And the way that God will use what you've gone through and your faithfulness to show them how to follow him. Of course, no greater example of this can be seen than in Christ, who, like Joseph, wrongfully endured the actions intended for evil by men, but that God intended for good. The rescue of us, his undeserving brothers and sisters. And so it seems to be a very small thing then, by comparison, to challenge us to have a growing vision to declare the goodness of God's plan through the tragedy of our lives to others. If he did it with the cross, he can do it with my life. And so we need to have a growing vision, joining with David in the Psalms and saying, so even to old age and gray hairs, O God, do not forsake me until I proclaim your might to another generation, your power to all those to come. That should be our generational mindset of doing good by faith, knowing how God uses our pain in the long run with the next generation. Third example of the goodness of God's plan here. It's seen in how he matures us in our faith. He matures us in our faith. The maturity of Joseph's view here should not be overlooked when he responds to his brother's fear of vengeance by him when he asks, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? Am I in the place of God? To which the assumed answer is no. No. But why does Joseph respond this way? Why does he ask this question? Is it because he thinks that the good that God has brought out of his situation justifies their actions? No. No, he grieves those actions. Everyone calls those actions evil, and those actions have had serious consequences. Then, is it because Joseph does not believe in justice and is undercutting the need for it? No. Rather, he is stating his confidence in God's justice. He's stating his confidence in God's justice. His belief here is a precursor to God's claim in Deuteronomy 32 when he says, "Vengeance is mine." Joseph's brothers are worried about his vengeance for their evil actions. Joseph writes it off to God's accounting of justice in saying in his response that I'm not God. I'm not God. And that spiritual maturity that God is looking to grow in us through our pain does not minimize justice, nor does it ignore evil, but it declares a confidence in God's accounting of all things. It trusts the Lord that when I've been wronged, God saw it. He's going to take care of it. And applying this, the Apostle Paul will pick this back up as a theme later in Romans chapter 12 when he says, "Repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' says the Lord." So if we're maturing in our faith, then we are not a get even sort of people. We're not a quick to sue kind of folks. If at all possible, we're going to pursue other means than the sword or the gavel or even the scathing review to remedy a situation. Not because we don't think it matters, but because we are confident in the Lord's justice and generous with his forgiveness. And truth be told, all such means of justice here and now are very limited in their effectiveness. They're very limited in their effectiveness. So that even while there are appropriate times to employ such means, we should be very sober-minded about their scope or ability. Instead, we should have the maturity to be very confident in God's justice so that we operate out of faith in his ability to make things right, far over and above any ability of our own. Final example of the kinds of good God brings out of evil that should spark growing faith in him with this text is this. One last one. He draws us to worship him. Don't miss this, like I said. He draws us to worship him. In verse 20, Joseph takes the horrors of his betrayal, his kidnapping, the lies, the greed, the neglect, the false accusations, the wrongful imprisonment, and more, and he uses all of those as mere opportunities to place the weight on the glorious wisdom of God. When he says, "As for you, you meant this evil against me, but God meant it for good." God meant it for good. Joseph looked at the evil in his past and he leveraged it to ascribe worth, value, and greatness to the wisdom of God. And when you stop and you ponder the myriad of details that had to be arranged for Joseph to go from living with his family as nomadic shepherds in the land of Canaan, all the way to being the prime minister of Egypt, the superpower on the earth at the time, they're incalculable. They're incalculable. And what it shows us is that none of this is random. None of these details are out of place. God has been working in and with all of the details. And yet Joseph's life, do you realize it's just one life? It's just one microcosm of all that God is doing, of all the details that he has been arranging and developing all along the way in his good plan to bring through the evil of this world redemption, That through Jesus, as the book of Revelation will put it, the Lamb who was slain before the foundations of the world, in one sense, that through whom God has, is, and will finish his good plan, and that everything will be brought into it. That offers us every reason for hope then for good to come from a sovereign God's will and plan for our lives. And when we see that and we consider all of the details of our lives, they're caught up in the same plan, then how can we not join in making such faith-filled statements that glorify God too? How can we but help to respond in the same kind of faith-filled worship of him? Seeing the wisdom of God rightfully leads us to ascribe worth to a God who is way beyond anything else we know. And when we do that, in full view of our pain, it is a beautiful expression of faith that God knows best. So that even when that worship is through tears, it is one that grows in confidence of him as it testifies to others that they can do the same. So let's do that together. With our closing song that really paints this picture well of this mighty God who is over our lives and whose plan moves through evil for our good, and who we choose to worship even when we choose to worship him through tears.